The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jen Hamrick Vanderwood. I'm the chair of our political action for candidate election here at NASW Minnesota, and we're so excited to have so many of you joining us for this really important topic and to be learning about our caucus and primary system here in Minnesota. So we're really excited to be welcoming Katharine Hill with us.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jen. Thanks for having me. My name is Katharine Hill, and I'm faculty at the School of Social Work at the University of St. Thomas in the Morrison Family College of Health. That's our new name. Everyone gets to hear me try that out for the first time. And I am delighted to be here to talk about the Minnesota caucus and primary system, and specifically how social workers can be engaged in that. I'm hoping that you'll be asking me questions as we go along. Jen is sitting next to me and will be sharing them as you type them into the text box. So please feel free as we go if things are not clear, or if you want some follow-up, to just go ahead and put those in there, and I will do my best to answer as we go along. I also have some resources that are in the slides, but that we'll also be sending out at the end. So if you have some questions about, like, where do I get that website, or wait, are you going to enter that, give us that address again? Yes, the answer is probably yes, we're going to do that. So the title for today's talk, or lunch and learn, whatever we're calling this webinar, is Social Work is Politics with Power, Minnesota Caucus and Primary Training for Social Workers. And this is my agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about caucuses and primaries, and how, as we were just discussing prior to beginning this, we have both in Minnesota. We do all the things here in Minnesota. So we are going to spend a couple minutes talking about how they are the same and how they are different. I'm going to walk you through what to expect at a caucus, at a precinct caucus, which is the first step in the caucus process in Minnesota. I'll give you some important dates and some resources so you can get that in your calendars and know where to look for more information. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be taking questions. I wanted to give credit for the title of this presentation. It's a quote directly stolen or borrowed from Barbara Mikulski, who is a U.S. Senator. She's retired. She was a Democrat from Maryland. She had her MSW, she still does, from the University of Maryland, referred to herself as a social worker. So she was a U.S. Senator who not only had an MSW, but claimed that MSW and said that what she was doing as a senator was social work with power. Prior to running for Senate, she worked directly with children and families in Baltimore, and then as a community organizer, and was first elected to the House in 1977. She was the first woman from her district elected, and then the first woman elected from Maryland into the U.S. Senate. So a pretty cool role model and a great quote. So keep that in mind as we go through. Okay, so in Minnesota, as I mentioned, we have caucuses and we have primaries. We have both. This is not the first time that we've had both a caucus and a presidential primary. This happened back in 1992 as well. That was right when I first moved to Minnesota. I don't remember it. So to me, this is brand new. So in 2016, the Minnesota legislature passed legislation creating a presidential primary in Minnesota. And it was really in response to the way the presidential caucuses had gone in Minnesota during the 2016 elections, that people felt that they were confusing, that they were overcrowded, that it took too long to get the results, that it wasn't an Iowa situation. There were no app failures. There was no concerns about the credibility of the responses, but just people didn't like that process for the presidential elections. So the legislature passed a law and said, okay, we're going to have a presidential primary in Minnesota, starting with the next presidential election, which is this year, 2020. So Minnesota is now a Super Tuesday state. We have a primary on March 3rd. However, we still have party caucuses. So the 4 major parties in Minnesota still do party caucuses. And so the caucuses, the first step of those, is on Tuesday the 25th at 7 p.m. And that is written into state law. So the precinct caucus, which is the first step, Tuesday the 25th at 7 p.m. The following week on Tuesday, we will have a presidential primary, which is on March 3rd. In August, we'll have a primary. So we have a second primary, which will not be a presidential primary. So there won't be any presidential candidates on the ballot in August. It will be US Senate, Congress, Minnesota Senate, Minnesota House, and then any other local elections or referendums that are coming up. So it won't be presidential. And then November 3rd, just mark your calendars now, that is the general election. You actually, just as a side note, for the presidential primary on March 3rd, you can be early voting for that now. So that's actually started. And for all of those people from Iowa and New Hampshire who like to claim that they were the first in the nation to vote, Minnesota, because we have such generous early voting, we actually started voting first. So I just like to, own that a little bit. All right, so we have both a caucus and a primary, but they are different. The primary, like I said, is March 3rd. The only parties that are participating in the presidential primary are the two major parties, the DFL, the Democrats, and the Republican Party. So the DFL in Minnesota is the Democratic Party nationally. So there will be two ballots for the presidential primary. When you go to vote in the presidential primary, you will have to identify which ballot you want. Do you want the Republican ballot or do you want the Democratic ballot? The Republican ballot has one candidate and then a line, so you could write somebody else, but the name on the ballot is the president. On the Democratic side, there are 15 candidates listed because they had to print the ballots a while ago. And so those were all of the people who had filed to run in Minnesota at the time of the printing of the ballot. If you early voted and your candidate has since dropped out and you want to vote again, like you want to take back your vote, there is a mechanism for doing that you can find on the Secretary of State's website, and I can share that link at the end. But 15 on the Democratic side, 1.5 whatever on the Republican side if you know who you want to write in. So when you go to vote in the primary, like I said, you have to identify which party. And that list is private in that it's not being sold to outside groups. Amazon's not going to see which presidential party you voted for or anything like that. But that information will be shared with the political parties in Minnesota. So if you get the Democratic ballot, that information would be shared with the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party and the two other major political parties in Minnesota. So the other two major political parties in Minnesota, the way you become designated as a political party, let me explain that, is if you get a certain percentage of the vote in a past statewide election. And so the two parties that currently qualify for that in Minnesota, I should have looked this up before I got here. One of them is the Legalize Marijuana Now Party, and the other one is the one with cannabis in the title, Legalize Cannabis or something. I apologize, and I will look those up. But so there are four major parties. Two of them are Legalize Marijuana related, DFL, Republican. So that list is they won't see who you voted for. They'll just see that you voted for a Republican or a Democrat, and that list will be shared. There is currently legislation kind of swirling around at the Capitol to try to address this sharing of lists. So people may have heard something in the news about, oh wait, isn't that changing? People don't like having their information shared, but currently as the law stands, it'll be shared with the political parties. That's the primary. You go, you vote, you get a ballot. Are you looking up the names of the other two parties for me? Oh, thank you. Jen is looking up the names of the other two parties, and she will put them in the chat box. Thank you, Jen. Okay. The precinct caucuses are the week before the primaries. So the first thing you need to know about the precinct caucuses is that they are run by the parties, not by the state. So there's a cooperative relationship between the state and the parties in terms of the administration and like the sharing of the information, but they are run by the parties. So like the Republican Party runs the Republican caucuses. The Democratic Party runs the Democratic caucuses. And it's the state parties, not the nationals. And when you precinct level, really run by those even more local units. So like your Senate district, your local Senate district unit. What that means in reality is it's all volunteers, that everybody who's running the caucus is a volunteer. So if you're going to caucus, be kind. No one is getting paid to do this. They are in person. So have to go to caucus. And there's not, unlike in Nevada, early caucusing. Like the caucus is at 7 p.m. on the 25th. That is when the caucus is. There is a way, and I'll get to this later, to submit paperwork if you want to be considered for as a delegate, but you can't go on, you can't be there on the 25th. I'll cover that in a minute. But basically, for this point in time, if you want to go to the, if you want to participate in the caucus, you have to show up at the caucus. Yes.
So Katharine, we have two related questions. So one is if you have to be registered as a particular party to vote in the primary, for example, if someone is an independent.
You don't. So in Minnesota, you are not registered in a party when you go to vote. You're just registered to vote. So you can go to either, you can ask for either ballot. But the assumption is that when you ask for the ballot, you are saying, for the purposes of this election, am adhering to this party's platform, more or less. But you don't have to like show a membership card or anything like that.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, and then you said there was another question?
So I think that answered the other one, which is if someone aligns with one political party, could they vote for another party on the ballot?
They could. And the same thing with the caucuses. If you attend the caucus, the assumption is, and you're asked to I think the language they use is attest to, they ask you to state, you know, if you're at the DFL caucus, they sort of want you to say, okay, while I'm here, I agree by and large with the DFL. Like I am here as sort of someone who wants to be part of this party. But there's not again, like a background check or a ID card or anything. You just go do it. You have to be eligible to vote in the general election in order to participate in the caucus. So 17-year-olds can go to the caucus if they will be 18 by the time the general election rolls around. So, and often I will say, I often bring my daughter. So you can also, there are often children at the caucus. It is all of your friends and neighbors. Okay, so the precinct caucus on February 25th is the first in a series of meetings that the parties hold that sort of culminate in the national conventions. So, wow, that's really small print. So sort of the way it works, it starts with the precinct caucus, and this is the one that's on February 25th. And the precinct is like a subunit of your Senate district at the state level, not at the federal level. So not Senate like Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar, Senate like who represents you in St. Paul as your state senator. And then the precinct is a smaller subunit within that. The lines are drawn based on census data from the previous census. So it's based on population. I live in St. Paul. My precinct caucus really covers like a couple of blocks because it's pretty dense. It then, as you go through the caucus system, moves up in the size of the geography it covers. So the precinct caucus, the next stage is the Senate District Caucus, which covers the whole state Senate district. The Republican Party refers to that as the Base Party Operating Unit, or the BPOU. It's the same thing, it's just different language. After that, it goes to the Congressional District. So that would be the area covered by the U.S. Congress people. So Betty McCollum is the 4th district. So it's the 4th congressional district. The 5th congressional district is Ilhan Omar. The 1st is Pete Stauber, I think. So that's how that works. It's that larger unit. Then it goes to the state, which is the statewide convention, then the national convention. The dates for the Senate district and the congressional are going to vary depending on where you live, because those are set by those local units. So it'll be sometime between the precinct caucus and the state convention. The state convention are in early June, and the Democrats and the Republicans are both having them in Rochester. So you would have to go to Rochester to participate in that. At each one of these levels, delegates, which are basically representatives, are elected to represent their smaller unit at that next level up. So if you, for example, want to go to the Senate District Convention, you need to be elected to represent at your precinct caucus. So a certain number of people are elected at each precinct level to then go on to the Senate District. There's another election at the Senate District level. to go on to the congressional, and it keeps going up the chain. So if you're interested in participating in the national, which I know a lot of people in Minnesota are interested in this year, at least on the Democratic side of things, because it's in Milwaukee. And so everyone thinks, oh, great, I can drive. So the National Democratic Convention is in Milwaukee this year in, I think it's in July. The Republican is in Charlotte. It's also in midsummer. But if you're interested in sort of participating in that pathway, that's how you get on the train to do it. Okay, so far so good. Makes about as much sense as the process is going to. Okay, Precinct Caucus comes first. It's the first step of many. So the goals of the Precinct Caucus, one is this election of delegates, and I'll talk in a minute about how people actually get elected as delegates and why you might want to do that. The next is setting the party platforms. So there are certain fundamental things that every party agrees that if someone's going to be endorsed to run from that party, they're going to support certain policy positions, they're going to have certain stances on certain kinds of issues. Those are the party platforms. The party platforms in Minnesota start at the precinct caucus level, because that's where people can bring what are called resolutions, which are basically statements that you want the party to adopt as part of their platform. And so they're introduced at the first level at the precinct caucus, voted on at the precinct caucus, and then again, they go up that sort of chain of being voted on, and if they pass, getting passed up to the next one, but ultimately could end up as part of either the state platform, the state DFL platform, or the national Democratic platform. So that's another reason people would go to a precinct caucus, is to participate in setting that platform. The third, and if I was doing this from a party standpoint, this would be the first, is it's a way to engage participants in the parties. So that for the political parties, this is a big old recruitment opportunity, right? Because they have a bunch of people in a room who have said, I agree more or less with what you're doing, and I care enough about it to show up at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night in February. So there are going to be direct asks for all sorts of kinds of participation at the precinct caucuses. So direct asks for money, like literally a hat or an envelope will be passed with a please put money in here, because we had to pay to rent the rooms and pay the security and print the handouts, and please help us pay for it. Opportunities to volunteer, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those might be. And then opportunities to take on leadership roles in the parties. So again, if you're interested in getting involved in electoral politics, this is actually a really good way to get involved, because they will ask you to take on leadership, and then you can start to set the agenda, which is what we should all be doing. So those are the goals of the Precinct Caucus. However, this year, there will be no presidential business conducted at the precinct caucus level, because the precinct caucuses come before the presidential primary. So as part of the legislation getting passed in 2016, and then the parties sort of negotiating with the national parties about how is this going to work, they had to make a deal, right? If we're going to keep the caucuses, we cannot have people we can't have the party endorsing a candidate before the primary actually happens, because the primary has to happen first for us to know who won, right? It also means that we can't allocate delegates to presidential candidates at the precinct caucus level, because we don't know what the state's delegate allocation will be, because that is determined by the primary. So to say that another way, the primary determines, based on the percentage of the votes that the different people win, how many delegates they get from the state. So the person who wins the highest percent gets the most delegates, and then they're sort of allocated down from there. So number 2 gets slightly less, number 3 gets slightly less. That is decided at the primary this year. So you can't have people at the caucus saying, I want to go to my Senate district caucus because I want to be a delegate at the national convention for Bernie Sanders, because we don't know how many delegates Bernie Sanders is going to get from Minnesota yet. So this is different, and it's a little weird. I'm just going to name that it's a little weird. All of the people who are running the precinct caucuses have been trained and know this, but we've never done it like this before. So again, just remember, everyone's a volunteer, be kind. Okay, are any questions coming in? No? Oh, good, I'm doing so well. All right, so here's how the caucus works. It has to begin at 7 p.m., state law. The doors typically open at 6, so you can get there early. They are typically held in locations that are close geographically to where the precinct is. So a local high school, a library, a community center, a church basement, you know, like wherever there's room. So it should be in a building that if you live in that community, go, oh yeah, I know where that is. And then at the precinct level, again, at least in St. Paul, it's like a whole bunch of classrooms because we're all so small in terms of geography. It has to start at 7. You cannot begin to elect delegates until 7:30. So for the first half hour, and I'll go through a sample agenda in a minute, other business will be attended to. But the selecting delegates cannot begin until 7:30, and it cannot end before 8 p.m. I've never gone to a caucus where we've ended early and had to fill time. However, should that happen, it needs to sort of remain open until 8. No one's gonna like trap you in the room and make you stay. You could leave, but the people who are convening it, who are running the caucus, have to stay until 8 o'clock. Like I said, we're not talking about presidential candidates at that. Okay, so this is kind of a rough agenda. It'll be a little different, but there'll be some welcome and introductions depending on the number of people who are there. You know, it may just be going around the room. You probably are going to know a lot of people who are there because they're going to be people who live in your neighborhood. So you may know their names, or at the very least, you've probably run into them at the recycling bins and, you know, oh yeah, I remember you. So there'll be some getting to know each other. There will be requests for donations. I know in my precinct convener box, they actually give us like a shoebox to pass around for the donations. They will ask for volunteers. Roles that volunteers will have are both in the party, so things like we need a precinct chair, which is someone who runs the political activities in that precinct. We need someone to sit on the Senate district committee of our party to do this particular task. So that kind of thing, that isn't, but there also be requests for volunteers for roles at the caucus itself. We need people to help us count votes. We need people to help us run this meeting. So like there'll be those kinds of requests for volunteers as well. There'll be a review of the rules and the agenda. Those are both predetermined and set by the parties, but each precinct caucus can review them and make changes or suggestions as they'd like to. But everyone has to vote to participate. There'll be some kind of verification that people live in the precinct and are eligible to participate. So there's usually a map of the precinct that you look at when you sign in. The way this is run in my precinct caucus is that there's a sign-in sheet, there's a map that's literally like taped next to it so you can look to make sure that your house is actually within the lines. And then there's a statement that says, I agree with this party, I will be eligible to vote on election day, sign it. You know, like I said, no one's doing any hardcore checking. One just exception I want to mention that I think might be of interest to social workers here. Minnesota has a program called Safe at Home that's run through the Secretary of State's office that is for people who are leaving some kind of domestic or intimate partner violence situation and would not normally feel safe participating in the electoral process because some of that information is public. For example, you know, you would be signing in with an address and they don't want to sign in with an address because they don't want it to be known. If you are someone who's registered with Safe at Home, you can attend your caucus without signing in. So you just need to pre-notify the party chair for your precinct and say, I'm a Safe at Home person, or I'm working with someone who's at Safe at Home, and then they'll make arrangements. But you can still go to caucus as a Safe at Home participant and not sign in with your address. So that's an option. There will be someone who's running this meeting when you show up, but then there is a formal election of the chair of the caucus. 9 times out of 10, that's the person who's been running the meeting up until that date or till that moment in time. But sometimes someone wants to run the meeting and they didn't go to the training ahead of time, and they will offer. So again, if you're interested in running meetings, you can sign up to run a meeting. Election of precinct offers, I mentioned. Resolutions will be introduced sort of throughout the agenda. Often a lot of that gets done at the beginning because since you can't elect delegates until after 7:30, it's like something you can do. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the resolutions work. There will be announcements and visits from candidates. So I know on the DFL side, candidates are limited to 2 minutes. And one of the jobs of the precinct convener is to literally stand there with a stopwatch and like cut them off after 2 minutes. But, you know, people will be coming in and out of the room, whether it's candidates or their surrogates saying, I'm running for state house and here's why you should support me, or I'm really interested in this issue, here's why you should support me. So they'll be coming in and out of the room. And then there'll be the election of delegates and then the end. So that's what's covered on the agenda. Okay. Yes.
So could you elaborate on community caucuses such as Disability Caucus and Environmental Caucus?
Those are caucuses of the party. That's a different use of the word caucus. So there's actually a couple of different uses of the word caucus. So within, for example, the DFL party, there are subunits within the DFL. So there's like the DFL Feminist Caucus, the Environmental Caucus, the Disability Caucus. Those are statewide groups of members of the party, which means they identify as members of the party, who want to work on those specific issues within sort of the framework of the party. It's separate from these caucuses. They're also sometimes, just to make it even more confusing, people will refer to like the DFL caucus, you know, or the Senate caucus. Those are the elected officials at the legislature who belong to those groups. So it's just a different use of the word. Clear as mud?
You're getting comments about being a genius. So.
All right. I'm like, I feel like there's no way to answer that without saying the word caucus about 12 times. All right. So let me talk about resolutions. How am I doing for time? Oh, good. I'm good for time. Okay, so resolutions. Resolutions are the ideas and policies that you think the party should support. Okay, I think this is so cool. Like one of my formative political experiences in Minnesota. I moved out here to go to college. I went to a caucus training. It was face-to-face, not a webinar. They trained like 20, you know, eager young feminists at my college. And then we all trooped down the street a couple days later to participate in this caucus with our resolutions like clutched in our hot little hands that we had, you know, gotten from our different advocacy groups. And we proceeded to run the table because 20 like-minded people with the same issues showed up, which made us a really formidable voting bloc in that caucus. And we got every single resolution we wanted passed out of that caucus. And it just was this moment of realizing, you know, I had felt like I didn't know anything and I wasn't powerful and I didn't understand how party politics worked. And then I walked out and I was like, I just wrote the platform, you know, with my friends. So that's the cool thing I think about caucuses and about the resolution process. So you can write your own resolution. So you can come in and say, be it resolved that the Republican Party of Minnesota introduce a party resolution that social workers be better compensated for the work. I'm trying to pick something that like no one on this webinar would. Right? So, or you could go to an advocacy group. So a lot of advocacy groups have sample resolutions. So I know Take Action is putting out a lot of sample resolutions. Isaiah is putting out a lot of sample resolutions. I know that NASW Social Policy Action Network is coming out with resolutions, which will be shared. So you can also bring those. And that's an organizing technique that these advocacy groups use, because if they're trying to push an issue, if you can have the same resolution entered and passed in every single precinct caucus, then that sort of raises the likelihood that it's then going to pass at the next level, right? It shows more grassroots support. You need to bring your resolutions written down, so they need to be on paper. There are preset sample or preset resolution forms. Every party has their own resolution form, and I sent just blank ones ahead of time. And so those will be shared with you. You don't have to write your resolution on that form, but when you submit your resolution at the caucus, it needs to be attached to that form. So typically the precinct caucus chair will have some spare copies of the resolution form. Depending on your precinct caucus, that will be totally fine and they won't really need that many. Or if it's like my neighborhood, you would run out in about 1.5 minutes if people don't have their own copies, because everyone goes to my precinct caucus and everyone brings their own resolutions. So we will be there for hours. But so you, if you have the chance to print out the forms ahead of time, that would be a good option. You don't need to use a lot of flowery, fancy political language in the resolution. Just say what you want. So that's how resolutions work. Typically, okay. I'll talk about voting in a second. Okay. So that's how resolutions work. People introduce them, they're voted on, get carried forward.
So who reads them out loud?
The person who's bringing the resolution, typically. Okay. I have at times in my precinct caucus, or actually at other caucuses, at higher level caucuses, they might be read if someone either just is too shy to want to read their own thing out loud, or there's a language barrier, or there's a disability barrier. Someone else can read your resolution for you, but it's not typically sort of an organized, like everyone hands them in and then they get read by one person. Caucuses are a very transparent form of participation. Like everybody sees you, everybody's in the room together, your eyes are open the whole time. I was teaching a group of first-year college students to do this, and they kept trying to turn their backs so they couldn't see how people were voting, right? Because they were used to secret balloting. This is like the opposite of secret balloting. You are in the room together, looking each other in the face while you're doing it. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So the other sort of business of the caucus, and this is typically sort of the thing that people are excited about. Like this is the thing people are kind of there for, is to be a delegate. And at the precinct level, what you're running for or being elected to do is to be a delegate to the next level, which is the Senate district or base party operating unit convention. So it's not, you don't go precinct all the way to national. It's like precinct to the next one, and then you run again, and then you keep going up. The number of delegates per precinct is determined by voter turnout in that precinct in the past. So it's a preset number. Every precinct has a predetermined number of delegates that get sent up. If you are at a DFL caucus, there are rules, or there's some affirmative action rules. You have to have gender parity. There's usually some attempts at, and that's actually written into the rules. And then there also will be usually some other attempts at different kinds of representativeness. Something that's different this year, remember how I said you can't talk about presidential candidates? Typically in a presidential election year, people would be coming in to be delegates for a presidential candidate, right? This year you can't do that. So you can go in and be a delegate, say I want to be a delegate because I support a statewide candidate, so US Senate, your congressperson, your state house or state senator, or an issue. I'm a clean water delegate. I'm a social worker values delegate. In a lot of precincts, there are more slots for delegates than there are people who want to sign up for delegates. So it'll just be the precinct convener saying, hey, we have 10 delegates, there are 9 people in the room, how many people want to be a delegate? And it'll be like a show of hands, and everybody gets to go. In my precinct, hey, we have 10 delegates and there are 100 people in the room, how are we going to decide? So typically what will happen is that everyone who wants to be a delegate will get up and say something. Usually what they get to say is managed by the precinct convener in terms of length of time and sort of what they're allowed to say. But it's usually, your name at the precinct level, where you live, because remember, you're with your neighbors. So, you'll get people being like, I live on Main Street, I'm in that blue house on the corner. Like, people will talk about that. And then why they want to be a delegate. And then there'll be a vote in the room. The voting can happen a couple of different ways. Sometimes it's just a show of hands. People can call for a ballot, so you can have secret balloting. It's not that common to have secret balloting, but you can have secret balloting, and they have paper available, so you can, it works. Or you can do something called a walking sub-caucus, which I'll explain that in just a second, how that works. That's another special Minnesota thing. Walking sub-caucuses are pretty rare at the precinct caucus level. It's just sort of typically there's not enough people in the room that you really need to do it. Like you can just do show of hands, but know that that's an option. I wanted to mention here, if you want to be a delegate and you can't make it to the precinct caucus, you have to be wherever you have to be at 7 o'clock. You have childcare issues or family, you can't make it. There is you can fill out a form that's available on the websites for each of the parties. So the DFL party has a form, the Republican Party has a form, the marijuana parties have forms. Which is like an absentee form that you then send with one of your neighbors. So you fill it out and, my name is Katharine Hill. I want to be a delegate. I just can't be here tonight. And then that person can bring it to the precinct caucus. Mm-hmm. If you really want to be a delegate, you probably should go, because the people who aren't there only get filled in if you have that situation where you have 10 slots and only 9 people sign up, and then they just kind of stick you in to fill the spot. Like you don't get to make an argument for yourself if you're not there. But it is an option. Mm-hmm. Okay, questions?
Yep. So someone was at a caucus training by an advocacy group that contended the efforts to have equal numbers of females and males, and that it was not required. So can you talk more about that?
It depends on the party. So that's a DFL party rule that you have to have equal numbers of females and males. However, the last couple precinct caucuses that I've been to, the precinct has overridden that rule because it defines gender on the binary, and we don't want to define gender on the binary. And so instead we just say we need gender parity and representation. Mm-hmm. So you can do that at the precinct level. Mm-hmm. But the DFL rules do call for equal gender representation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So someone has a question who recently came to Minnesota about how long people have been campaigning to be delegates.
Not at all. Not at all. There definitely are people. I guess here's the best way to say this. Life is things are run by the people who show up. So people who are elected as delegates tend to be kind of known to their neighbors, not because they've been campaigning, but because if you've been to other caucuses and you stand up and everyone in the room knows you, they're more likely to be like, oh yeah, Jen went to this before, and we know she's, she lives around the corner from me and she's likely to do this. Mm-hmm. But it really is very open. Like I have, there are new people every year at my precinct caucus who either just haven't been engaged in the process before, or just moved, or just got old enough to do it. And at least I can speak very specifically to my precinct caucus, we're pretty excited to have them there. And so if they want to be a delegate, we're pretty happy to have them be a delegate. Once you get to the Senate district and then moving up to like the congressional district, those mm-hmm. levels, it starts to be a little bit more of a campaign situation. Mm-hmm. Not because individuals are campaigning to be delegates, but because the campaigns are trying to get their delegates selected. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to manage the process. Tina Smith for Senate campaign wants people who are going to support Tina Smith for Senate moving up to the state convention, to the, because they want their people there. And so they're trying to sort of manage the delegate selection process. And I'll show you, when I show you how a walking sub-caucus works, you'll see exactly how they try to do that. But so there's that process going on, but at the precinct level, that really doesn't come up. And, this year we can't talk about the presidency anymore. So did that answer that question? It's hard when there's questions and I can't see people's faces. So I'm going to assume I answered that clearly. Okay. There also are in every precinct, I just want to mention alternate slots. So for every delegate, there's an alternate. So if you want to be a delegate and you don't get elected, you probably can also go as an alternate, and every alternate usually gets a chance to participate. So the alternates also go to the next level. They go to the convention. They just aren't on, it's called being on the floor. Like that's where the actual action is, the voting happens. They sit, again, my district convention is in a high school gym. So the alternates sit on the bleachers and the delegates stand on the floor. But then if one of the delegates has to leave the floor, an alternate comes in and takes their spot. Might be a slightly different setup. Maybe there aren't bleachers. All right, so you can't be a delegate for a presidential candidate. This will be confusing. I'm looking forward to seeing how people manage, whether they come in and say, I'm for, I don't know, free college, Medicare for all, and whatever. Guess who my candidate is, you know? Or whether there's going to be like some, you know, just not talking about it. We'll see. All right, so I want to talk about a walking subcaucus. So this is a special Minnesota thing that we only do in Minnesota. Some people I've heard call this an Iowa walking subcaucus, but they don't do this in Iowa. So just if you've heard someone call it the Iowa walking subcaucus, they do subcaucus in Iowa, but not this way. So this video that I'm about to show you is about 2 minutes long. It was done by someone in Congressional District 2, so they mentioned CD2 a couple of times, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't actually have any sound other than this really dippy music that plays underneath it, so I'm not sure if the sound will work or not, but if you can't hear anything, don't worry. All you need to be able to do is see what's happening. So I'm going to show this, and then I'll sort of talk through what happened, and hopefully this works. Okay, let me talk that through. Usually I actually make people do that. Okay, so the way the walking subcaucuses work, and again, this is likely not going to happen at the precinct caucus, but it will happen at the next level. People name what they want to be in a subcaucus for. So it might be a candidate, it might be an issue, it might be a combination of a candidate and an issue, or you could see in the video there was uncommitted, right? So everyone goes up. Literally at my Senate district convention, people make signs and they decorate them and they come in and they walk to the front of the high school gym and they hold up their sign and there's like glitter and balloons on their signs and they say, here's what I'm doing, and then they walk. Okay, so everyone goes up, however many people want to do that, and they go and they stand around the room with their signs. And then they say the floor is unfrozen, the floor is open, and everyone who didn't go up and say what they wanted to do, didn't, or name a sub-caucus, sorts themselves into the groups of the sub-caucus that most represents them. So if you're a clean water person and there's a clean water sub-caucus, you're going to go stand in the clean water sub-caucus, okay? After a certain period of time, and it's announced ahead of time how long that is, the floor is frozen and the number of people in each group is counted. And what you're trying to achieve is what's called viability. And sort of the easiest way to figure out viability is it's the number of it's the number of people who are present in the entire caucus, not sub-caucus, caucus, divided by the number of delegates. So to make my math super easy, if we had 100 people in the room and we had 10 delegates, then you need to have 10 people in a sub-caucus for it to be viable. Does that make, like, we can talk about theoretically, does that make sense? But like, does that make sense? Okay, so everyone gets into their sub-caucuses. But probably what's happened is that you don't have 10 groups of 10, right? You probably have a couple of groups of 20, one group of 2, whatever. So then after everyone kind of looks around and you find out how many are in each group, then the floor is unfrozen again, and the sub-caucuses have an opportunity to sort of resort themselves. So the ones that don't have viability either need to go join with somebody else. So let's say you had clean water and very clean water. Maybe they could just be together, right? Or you could try to siphon some people off from another one. Hey, clean water is really important, and we have good environment over there. Can we get some good environment people to come stand in the clean water group? This is where you might see candidates, campaigns. This is where campaigning starts to happen, because if I'm a candidate, I want my candidates' delegates to move forward. So I'm trying to manage the sub-caucusing. And so they will be in there when the floor is unfrozen, literally moving people. Because the thing is, let's say you have a group of 20, that's 2 delegates that are going to come out of that group, right? But if you have a group of 25, that's not 3 delegates, it's still 2 delegates. So you might, if you were a campaign, try to take those 5 people who are sort of extra and move them to someplace else so you could get a delegate out of that sub-caucus that was good for your candidate. But as an attendee, you don't need to be worrying about that, other than people may be trying to move you. You can ignore them. You don't have to participate.
So why is Minnesota the only state that uses walking
I
sub-caucus?
do not know.
Okay.
I have asked that question.
What do other states do?
Well, not every state has a caucus. Iowa does have a sub-caucus and a caucusing process. It's just a little bit different. And if people really care, I have another really cute video with Lego figurines that explains the Iowa caucus process. It's just a variation on the theme.
So how do walking sub-caucuses align with delegate decisions made by the primary?
So once we know how many delegates each candidate has moving forward from the primary, that can then become part of the walking sub-caucuses at the Senate district, congressional district, etc. levels. I will be totally honest, I'm not totally sure how that's going to work because I've never seen it before. When I've asked the people who are higher up in the party than me, which is everybody, it's not me, they say, oh yeah, we'll figure it out. But so it'll be part of that conversation and it will be known. I don't know quite how the math will be done, but it will be part of the math. Are there other questions? Because walking sub-caucuses are kind of weird. They're very transparent democracy with all the good and all the bad. Okay, so I define nominating a sub-caucus. Frozen, people will talk about the floor being frozen. That means no one's allowed to move. It also means no one's allowed on the floor who's not a delegate. So that's a moment where if you're an alternate, you're still in the bleachers. If you're a campaign, you're not allowed on the floor anymore. But then they'll talk about it being unfrozen and not all of a sudden, but like then all these people kind of come onto the floor and people are going on and off. And so that language, I talked about delegates, I talked about viability. And then within the sub-caucuses, so let's say you're in a sub-caucus that has 20 people, you can send 2 delegates from that. the issues of representation and gender equity are then going to have to be decided within that sub-caucus of 20 people about which to go forward. So, you know, if you have 2 slots going forward, they shouldn't both be men. That kind of thing. So that will be part of the decision. And the sub-caucus elects the delegates from the sub-caucus to go on to the next one. So there's some campaigning that happens there, not on a long-term viewpoint, but on a short-term, like you're standing in this group of people, you're trying to make the case. Here's why I should keep going. Let me also just quickly say, because I know we're running close to time, that you don't have to be, like, you could go to the Senate District Convention, participate in the sub-caucusing, and not run as a delegate. Like, you could just go and participate and try to get your issue moving forward, but if you know you can't make the state convention in Rochester, that's just not going to work for you. You don't have to be a delegate. It's just usually people want to be a delegate. Okay. I quickly wanted to talk about accessibility issues with the caucuses, because again, this is something that comes up. So they are supposed to be fully ADA compliant. If you think about the public spaces that are in our communities, some of them are more so, some of them are less than. I think as social workers, this is something we certainly are going to be wanting to think about if we're wanting to support clients in participating in caucuses, or personally, we may need to be thinking about it. So they should be an accessible space. They're not always. Planning ahead is always helpful. So if you, for example, know that you are bringing a neighbor, or you're trying to help a client think it through and they have physical disabilities, you might want to just do some pre-planning and asking some questions about access to the space. There also usually will be translation services available if it's known that ahead of time that translation services are needed. So for example, when I've participated in citywide caucuses and conventions in St. Paul, they will usually have 5 to 6 different simultaneous language translation available. So there'll be people with like those headsets on, and then people sitting at the front speaking into microphones and doing same time translation. But there's not a guarantee that someone's very specific language is going to be available translated. They sort of do a best guess situation, which again, I think is someplace as social workers, we can come in and we can advocate. We can say ahead of time, we have clients coming who have this specific need. We also can work to help clients think about translation needs ahead of time, because remember, the parties are all volunteers. So whoever is there is doing it as a volunteer. But I just wanted to mention real quick accessibility, because it is an issue with caucusing. I know that some of the presidential campaigns have at times, and some of the statewide campaigns have at times offered childcare. I haven't heard specifics for the Minnesota caucus this year, but if that's something that is important, I would recommend reaching out and asking. It won't be the party that's offering it. You know, the Republican Party will not be offering childcare. It will be the person running for office in that party. Okay. How do you find out more information? So there's a link here to the Secretary of State's website that includes the Caucus Finder. So if you go to this link and you enter in your address, it will tell you where to go for each of the 4 major parties. So all 4 parties are having their caucuses. They will all be on the 25th at 7 p.m. But where they are depends on where you live. The political party of your choosing, of your interest, they all have more information in the way that is specific to that party. So some of them have a lot of information, some of them have less information, some, you know, but they all have what they feel is important for their party members. And then advocacy groups are a great resource for these, because they are trying to get people to attend. So those are where I would recommend going to find more information. And Jen is going to share links again at the end of this. Just a reminder about the election calendar. So the 25th is the Precinct Caucus. The 3rd is the presidential primary. The 11th of August is the primary for everything that was that we began to decide at the Precinct Caucus, but not the presidential election. And then the 3rd is the general election. And that's my email if anyone has questions. Does anyone have questions?
There is not any at the moment.
That is shocking.
Nope, there's some coming in.
Okay, I will do my best.
So someone is making the comment that the DFL has historically refused to allow candidates to provide childcare.
Oh, interesting. That hasn't been my experience, so that's fascinating. It must really vary where you are.
There's another question about citizenship and whether or not you have to be a citizen to participate.
You do have to be eligible to vote, so yes, you do have to be a citizen.
Do caucuses only happen in presidential election
Oh
years?
no, caucuses happen any year there is an election. So there will be and it'll vary depending on where you live, because it depends on the election that's being held in your, this is all based on geography, right? So in your geographic area. So I live in St. Paul. So we had caucuses in 2019 because we had city elections. We had caucuses in 2018 because there were congressional and state house elections. We had caucuses in 2017 because there were city elections. So I mean, like we do them pretty much every year. I know last year Minneapolis did not have caucuses, which caused a lot of anxiety for people who lived in Minneapolis and heard from people in St. Paul that they were going to caucus because they felt like they were missing something. So the Secretary of State's website is a good place to look for more information, or again, the party unit in your area would be the others who know.
And when is the Senate District Caucus?
It depends on where you live. So every Senate district gets to set their own Senate District Caucus date. Typically mid-March, but when and where is set by that base party operating unit or Senate district unit.
And where could someone find rules for party caucuses?
On the party websites. And all 4 parties I did check do have a caucus tab on their website or a caucus link on their website. I will say that the DFL has a huge amount of information on their website. So even if you don't plan to caucus as a DFLer, but are just wanting more sort of information, if you can't find something on your parties, they at least have something that you could extrapolate a bit from. It's quite impressive how much information is on that website.
Well, so that does it for the questions. So thank you so much, Katharine.
Thank you.
Just a few kind of housekeeping things. So your continuing education credit will be emailed out to you. Additionally, we recorded this session and it will be going up on NASW Minnesota's YouTube page. So please share that link widely. We want as many social workers and other people to know this information as possible. As we mentioned earlier, NASW Minnesota will be sending out resolutions by Monday, both to our email list and posting on our Facebook page. And so please take those with you to your caucus. Additionally, check out the NASW Minnesota legislative agenda. There's a link both in the chat box here, and you can also find it on our website. So thank you all so much for spending this time with us and for being engaged in the political process. And we hope to see you all caucusing.
Bye.